Good morning, Backyard Kids. This month, we are digging into God's Word, looking for wisdom. And this dig brings us to a character in the Old Testament who was famous for wisdom, and his name was King Solomon. You probably remember learning at some point about King David. He was pretty famous. After all, he was anointed to be king when he was very young. He killed the giant Goliath with just a few stones. And he wrote many of the songs and the poems that we find in the book of Psalms. So David was an amazing king. He wasn't perfect, but he was great. And from his family line, Jesus was even born. And David had a son named Solomon. So when David died, Solomon became king at a very young age. So, like I said, he was very young. He had no experience at ruling anybody, much less God's wonderful and chosen people. But Solomon's father, King David, had taught him some very important things. And one of those was to listen to God's word. And so Solomon showed his love for God by obeying God's laws. Solomon also, after he became king, wanted to thank God for all that he had done. And so he traveled to the city of Gibeon, and there he offered 1,000 sacrifices to God. One night, while he was staying there, God came to Solomon in a dream. And in that dream, God spoke to him and told Solomon that he could ask for anything that he wanted. Now remember, Solomon was young. He was just a kid. Most kids aren't grown up and mature enough yet to make good choices about things like that. He could have asked for material things. He could have asked for even more money. I mean, he was already pretty rich. He could have asked for a beautiful girlfriend or the coolest camel to travel around on. Or he could ask to live forever, or at least to have a really long life. But instead, Solomon chose to ask for wisdom. He told God he knew that he was young. He was aware that he didn't know the right way to do his duties as king. He didn't know the right way to rule over God's people. And so he asked God to give him an understanding heart that he could tell the difference between right and wrong. God was so pleased with Solomon's choice that he had asked for wisdom instead of money or fame or to defeat his enemies, that he gave him what he asked for, a wise and understanding heart. So Solomon returned to Jerusalem, where he offered even more sacrifices to honor God once he had gotten back, and then he held a huge feast for all of his officials. Very soon, though, Solomon's gift of wisdom was tested in a really, really big way. One day, 2 women came to see him, asking for his help in settling an argument. See, both of these women had recently had a baby, but one of the babies had died, and now both women were claiming that the living baby was theirs. And so they came to Solomon asking for help with this problem. Solomon thought about it for a minute, and then he asked one of his servants to bring him a sword. What? Why would he ask for a sword? So, you guys, you're going to have to hang on because this is kind of a wild story here. Because Solomon then told one of his servants to cut the baby in 2 and to give a half to each of the mothers. Now, before we finish the story, I want to make sure you know that Solomon never really intended to cut this sweet little baby in half. But what Solomon knew, thanks to the wisdom that God had given him, is that this way he would be able to figure out who the real mother was. He could get to the truth. And sure enough, it worked. The woman who was truly the baby's mother was filled with too much love to allow her child to be hurt. She would rather her child be raised by someone else than to see him be killed, and so she immediately said, "Let the other woman have him." And the woman that was lying, well, she didn't have anything to lose. She was so heartbroken by the death of her own child that she would rather someone else hurt too. And so she said, "Go ahead, cut him in half, and then neither of us will have him." Wow. So it became pretty clear pretty quickly who the real mother was, and Solomon ordered that the child be given back to her. After this, news of Solomon's wisdom and his fair decision-making spread far and wide throughout the nation. Guys, Solomon was put in an almost impossible situation, except for one thing. He had asked God for wisdom, and he trusted that God had fulfilled his promise and given that to him. So when Solomon was faced with this horrible situation, he was able to trust that God had given him the wisdom to make the right decision. And the same is true for us today. When we ask God for wisdom, we can trust God, just like Solomon did. He can help us find out what we should do and then give us the strength to do it. So don't forget, when you need wisdom, you can ask God to help you, just like Solomon did. Have a great week.